Patterson, you're done. Clear out your office. Those words hit me like a sledgehammer at 9:15 a.m. on what should have been the biggest day of my career. I'm Michael Patterson, 55 years old, and I'd just spent 18 months putting together an $850 million deal with Gulf States Petroleum. 18 months. And this kid, Austin Caldwell, 28, fresh out of Harvard with his MBA and the weight of impossible expectations from his CEO father, just fired me 1 minute before I was supposed to sign the biggest contract in Lone Star Energy Corporation's history. Let me back up a bit. I've been in the energy business for 27 years, started right after my 6-year stint in the Marines, worked my way up from field engineer to senior sales director. I know this industry inside and out, from offshore drilling rights to pipeline capacity calculations to environmental impact assessments. The kind of stuff they don't teach you in business school. Austin Caldwell was different. He was Harold Caldwell's son, yes, the CEO's son, and he'd been brought in 6 months ago as the new director of strategic operations. That's corporate speak for daddy gave me a job. But here's the thing about Austin that most people missed. He wasn't stupid. He had genuine talent, real analytical skills, and he understood modern business better than most of us old-timers. His problem wasn't incompetence, it was pressure. Harold Caldwell had built Lone Star Energy from a small Houston outfit into a $2.3 billion company over 20 years. That's a hell of a legacy for any son to live up to, especially when everyone's watching to see if you earned your position or just inherited it. Austin felt that pressure every day, and it made him desperate to prove himself quickly. "We need to disrupt the old paradigms, Patterson," he'd say in meetings, throwing around buzzwords like digital transformation and synergistic solutions. But when we talked one-on-one, away from the corporate theater, Austin would ask smart questions about reservoir engineering and regulatory compliance. The kid was learning, but he was in a hurry. The Gulf States deal started 18 months ago when I got a call from their acquisition team. They were looking to expand their North American operations and needed someone who understood both the technical and regulatory side. That was my wheelhouse. I'd been building relationships with Gulf States for over a decade, ever since my Navy buddy Jim Rodriguez introduced me to their Houston office back in 2010. The negotiations were brutal. These weren't your typical American corporate types. Gulf States moved slowly, methodically. Every detail mattered. Every clause got scrutinized by 3 different legal teams. They wanted guarantees on production capacity, environmental compliance, regulatory approvals, and about 50 other technical specifications that would make most people's eyes glaze over. The deal involved offshore drilling rights in the Gulf of Mexico, specifically Block 447 and adjacent parcels totaling 89,000 acres. Gulf States wanted assured production capacity of 45,000 barrels per day, with environmental impact assessments for deep-water operations exceeding 5,000 feet. The regulatory maze alone included approvals from BOEM, EPA, Coast Guard, and state authorities in Texas and Louisiana. But I loved it. This was the kind of deal you work your whole career for. Not just the money, though my 2.5% commission on $850 million would set Linda and me up nicely for retirement, but the reputation. Landing Gulf States would put Lone Star Energy on the map as a serious player in the international market. Austin, meanwhile, kept trying to optimize my approach. He'd sit in on client calls and suggest we leverage AI-driven analytics or implement blockchain solutions for supply chain transparency. I'd have to mute the phone and give him a look that said, "Let me handle this." The worst part was Austin's internal pressure. Harold would ask him pointed questions in executive meetings. How's the Gulf States integration going? Are we maximizing the strategic value? Austin would promise improvements and efficiencies that frankly weren't necessary. The deal was solid as negotiated, but Austin felt he had to add his mark to justify his position. 3 months ago, things escalated. Austin brought in Amanda Wells, a consultant from McKinsey, who'd never worked in energy but had a PhD in business analytics. This was Austin's attempt to bring data-driven insights to what he saw as my relationship-based approach. "Michael," Amanda would say in that precise tone that elite consultants perfect, "my models indicate potential margin improvements of 12% through restructured payment terms and optimized delivery schedules." I tried to explain that Gulf States wasn't some Silicon Valley startup. They were a $200 billion corporation with procedures that went back decades. You don't just walk in and demand they change their payment systems because an algorithm suggests it. But Austin was caught between his father's expectations and Amanda's confident projections. The breaking point came 2 weeks ago. Austin scheduled a strategy review with Harold, his father, to discuss optimization opportunities in the Gulf States deal. I walked into that conference room thinking we were going to review final logistics. Instead, I found myself defending 18 months of careful work to a young executive who felt he had to prove his worth by improving everything his predecessors had built. "Dad," Austin said, and the formality felt forced, "I think we need to consider some alternative approaches here. Michael's done excellent foundational work, but there are optimization opportunities we haven't explored." Harold looked uncomfortable. He'd been CEO for 20 years and understood the value of proven relationships. But Austin was his son, fighting to establish his own credibility in a company where everyone knew his last name had gotten him in the door. The trap was closing, and I could feel it. Amanda, the consultant, jumped in with her charts and graphs, explaining how they could optimize stakeholder value by renegotiating key terms. I watched 18 months of careful relationship building get reduced to PowerPoint slides and spreadsheet models that showed impressive efficiency gains on paper, but ignored the human element that made deals like this actually work. "Michael," Harold finally said, "maybe you could work with Austin and Amanda to incorporate some of these optimization strategies." That's when I knew I was in serious trouble. In corporate speak, work with means do what they say. I was about to become a figurehead on my own deal, and Austin would get the credit for closing the biggest contract in company history. But here's the thing about having 27 years of experience in an industry where handshake agreements can be worth more than legal contracts. You learn to plan for contingencies. Back when I first started serious negotiations with Gulf States, I'd had a conversation with my lawyer buddy Pete Morrison about protecting myself if things went sideways. The conversation happened after the Chevron Texaco debacle in 2019, where a senior negotiator got pushed out 3 days before signing a major acquisition deal. The replacement couldn't close it, the deal fell apart, and the company lost $400 million in projected revenue. Pete had been the guy's attorney when he sued for wrongful termination. "Mike," Pete told me over beers at Kirby's Ice House, "these big energy deals are all about relationships and technical knowledge. Companies forget that when they get greedy or start playing politics. You need protection." That's when Pete suggested something called a key person clause with specific technical requirements. It wasn't just about designating me as important, it was about creating legitimate technical and regulatory reasons why only I could execute the final contract. The genius was in the details. Gulf States required someone with specific certifications: offshore drilling safety certification, EPA environmental compliance certification, and DOE international energy transaction approval. I had all three. Most importantly, I was the only person at Lone Star Energy who held the DOE certification for transactions exceeding $500 million with OPEC-affiliated entities. Pete drafted language that designated me as the certified primary technical liaison and regulatory compliance officer for the Gulf States contract. The clause was buried on page 47 of a 68-page agreement, written in dense legal language that looked like standard boilerplate. But it essentially said that Michael Patterson had to personally execute the final contract signing, or the entire agreement would be null and void due to regulatory noncompliance. Gulf States approved it without hesitation. Why wouldn't they? Their legal team saw it as additional protection. They were dealing with someone who had proper certifications and regulatory authority. To them, it was just good business practice. To me, it was insurance I hoped I'd never need. I never told anyone about the clause, not Harold, not Austin, not even Linda. It was my ace in the hole, sitting there in black and white legal language that would hold up in any court in Texas. The morning of the signing, everything seemed to be going according to Austin's plan. I got to the office at 7 a.m. and found him already there reviewing his notes with Amanda. They'd prepared presentation materials, talking points, even arranged for catering that included traditional Arabic coffee, something I'd suggested months ago that Austin had appropriated as his own idea. "Morning, Michael," Austin said, and I could see the nervous energy in him. This was his big moment, his chance to prove he belonged at the executive level. "Everything ready for the big day?" "All set," I said. "Gulf States lands at Hobby Airport at 8:30, should be here by 10 a.m. Perfect. Amanda and I have prepared some additional value propositions to present during the signing ceremony. That made me nervous." Khalid Al-Mansouri, Gulf States Chief Acquisition Officer, hated surprises. We'd spent months finalizing every detail, and now Austin wanted to spring additional value propositions on him during what was supposed to be a ceremonial signing. "Austin," I said carefully, "Khalid isn't expecting a presentation. This is just putting pen to paper. Trust me, Michael. This will show them that Lone Star Energy is thinking strategically about the partnership." At 9:15, Austin walked into my office with that determined look he got when he'd made a decision he thought was bold and necessary. "Patterson, we need to talk." I looked up from my final preparations. The Gulf States delegation would be arriving in 45 minutes, and I was double-checking the signature pages and regulatory compliance certificates. "Austin, we've got Gulf States arriving shortly. Whatever it is can wait." "No, it can't." He closed the door and sat down without being invited. "I've been talking with Dad and Amanda, and we've decided to restructure the team leadership for this signing." My stomach dropped. "What kind of restructuring?" "Effective immediately, you're being reassigned to senior business development. Amanda will be taking over as lead on Gulf States, and I'll be handling the signing ceremony and ongoing relationship management." I stared at him. "You're serious about this? Completely serious. Your foundational work has been excellent, but we need someone who understands modern partnership dynamics to take this relationship to the next level." The kid was scared. I could see it now. Harold had been pushing him to make his mark, and Austin had convinced himself that taking over my deal was the way to prove his worth. Amanda had filled his head with optimization theories, and he genuinely believed he could improve on 18 months of relationship building with a PowerPoint presentation and some business school jargon. "So what happens to me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Senior business development. There's an office on the 3rd floor. You'll be developing new opportunities while we execute on the current pipeline." Business development. Corporate purgatory for executives they can't fire but don't know what to do with. I looked at Austin sitting there in his $2,000 suit, fighting his own internal battles while trying to project confidence he didn't really feel. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a kid with genuine intelligence and business skills, but he was so desperate to prove himself that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. "All right," I said finally. "You want to handle the signing? Go ahead." He looked surprised. I think he expected me to fight, to make a scene, to demand a meeting with Harold. "Really? You're okay with this transition?" "Austin, you're the director. If you think you can manage Gulf States better than I can, that's your call." He seemed relieved, like he'd been bracing for a confrontation. "I knew you'd understand. This is really what's best for the company." "Just one thing," I said, standing up to shake his hand. "Make sure you read the entire contract before you sign. All 68 pages. Gulf States is extremely particular about regulatory compliance and technical specifications." "Of course," he said, and I could see a flash of irritation. "I've been reviewing the key terms all week with Amanda." The key terms. Not the whole contract. Just Amanda's executive summary that focused on financial structures and delivery schedules, but glossed over the regulatory requirements that made up about 30% of the actual document. I watched Austin walk out of my office to prepare for his moment of glory, and I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. At 10 a.m. sharp, the Gulf States delegation arrived. I positioned myself in the break room where I could see into the main conference room through the glass walls. There was Khalid al-Mansouri, impeccably dressed as always, carrying the leather portfolio he'd had custom-made in Dubai. There was Sarah Kim, their legal counsel, who'd probably read our contract more times than anyone except Pete Morrison. There was Ahmed Rashid, their technical director and my closest contact in their organization. These weren't faceless corporate executives. They were people I'd shared hundreds of meals with, people who'd invited me to their homes, people who trusted me with details about their families and career concerns. Ahmed and I had bonded over our military backgrounds. He'd served in the UAE Armed Forces before getting his petroleum engineering degree from UT Austin. I watched Khalid introduce his team to Austin and Amanda. I could see the polite confusion on their faces. They were expecting me. Sarah Kim looked around the room, clearly wondering where I was. But Austin launched into what I'm sure was a well-rehearsed presentation about Lone Star Energy's strategic vision and innovative partnership approach. The actual signing was supposed to be purely ceremonial. All the real negotiations were done months ago. This was just putting pen to paper, taking photos for the company newsletter, and opening a bottle of champagne that Harold had been saving for the occasion. Austin picked up his Mont Blanc pen and turned to the signature page with the confidence of someone who'd never had a deal blow up in his face. Amanda sat next to him with her laptop open, probably ready to pull up charts if anyone had questions about optimization opportunities. That's when I saw Sarah Kim lean forward and whisper something urgent to Khalid. Khalid frowned and whispered back. Then Ahmed pointed to something specific in the contract that made all three of them sit up straighter. I couldn't hear what they were saying through the glass, but I could read the body language. Something was very wrong. Austin looked confused. He said something to Amanda, who started typing frantically on her laptop, probably searching for whatever clause the Gulf States team had found. Harold was leaning forward, trying to figure out what was happening to his son's big moment. Sarah Kim stood up and walked around the table to point at something specific in the contract. I could see Austin's face go white as he read whatever she was showing him. Khalid was shaking his head slowly, the way he did when someone suggested something that violated regulatory protocols. Ahmed, my old friend who understood the technical requirements better than anyone, gathered his papers and said something that made the entire Gulf States team stand up. That's when Austin bolted from the room. He came running down the hallway toward my office like the building was on fire, his carefully styled hair disheveled and his confident demeanor completely shattered. "Patterson!" he shouted, loud enough that half the office turned to look. "What the hell is this clause on page 47? I looked up from my coffee with practiced innocence. Which clause would that be? The one that says Michael Patterson has to personally execute the contract as certified regulatory compliance officer, or the whole deal is void. Oh, that one. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Yeah, Gulf States insisted on that about 8 months ago. DOE requires certified personnel for transactions with OPEC-affiliated entities exceeding $500 million. Why didn't you tell me about this? You fired me, remember? You said Amanda was taking over as lead on Gulf States. Austin's face was turning red, and I could see the panic setting in. Patterson, you have to come sign this right now. Actually, I don't have to do anything. I'm in senior business development now, remember? Third floor office? This is not a game. That's an $850 million deal in there. I know exactly what it is. I spent 18 months putting it together. That's when Harold Caldwell appeared around the corner, looking like a man who'd just watched his biggest success turn into his most expensive failure. Behind him was Amanda, clutching her laptop and looking like she was about to be sick. "Michael," Harold said, and I could hear 20 years of CEO authority trying to mask genuine desperation. "We need to talk. Right now." The three of us ended up in Harold's office while the Gulf States team waited in the conference room, probably checking their phones and wondering if they should reschedule their flights back to Dubai. I could see Austin was practically vibrating with panic, but I kept my voice calm and professional. "Here's the situation," I explained to Harold. Gulf States specifically required certified regulatory compliance for this transaction. The DOE mandates that any energy deal exceeding $500 million with OPEC-affiliated entities must be executed by someone holding current certifications in offshore drilling safety, EPA environmental compliance, and international energy transactions. "Can't we just transfer the certifications to Austin?" Harold asked. "The certifications take 18 months to complete and require field experience. Austin would need to spend 6 months on drilling platforms, complete 200 hours of EPA coursework, and pass the DOE examination." Austin looked like he was going to be sick. "Can't we amend the contract?" "Not without going back to their legal team in Dubai," I said. "That would probably take 8 to 12 weeks, assuming they even approve the change. And Khalid mentioned they have other acquisition opportunities in Venezuela and Nigeria. They won't wait." Harold was aging before my eyes. 20 years of building Lone Star Energy, and he was watching it potentially crumble because his son had outmaneuvered himself. "What do you want, Michael?" Harold asked quietly. That was the question, wasn't it? I could have asked for Austin's job. I could have demanded a corner office or a public apology or Harold's resignation. But that wasn't what this was about. "I want to finish what I started," I said. "I want to sign this deal, represent Lone Star Energy the way I have for 27 years, and then we can discuss what comes next." Harold nodded slowly. "And Austin?" I looked at the kid, sweating in his expensive suit, learning the hard way that business school case studies don't prepare you for real-world consequences. Austin has talent, I said, but maybe he should learn the business before trying to revolutionize it. We went back to the conference room, where Khalid and his team were politely pretending to review documents while trying not to look annoyed. The moment I walked in, the energy shifted completely. "Michael!" Khalid stood up and embraced me like the old friend he'd become. "Where have you been?" "We were concerned something had happened. Just some last-minute coordination," I said, "but I'm here now." Sarah Kim smiled for the first time all morning. "Good. We were wondering who was going to handle the regulatory filings." The signing took exactly 12 minutes. Khalid and I exchanged the kind of comfortable conversation you have with someone you've known for years. Ahmed asked about Linda and whether we were still planning that trip to the UAE he'd been inviting us to take. Sarah mentioned that her daughter had started at Rice University and was considering petroleum engineering. These were relationships built over years of shared problem-solving, mutual respect, and genuine friendship. You can't fake that kind of trust, and you definitely can't transfer it with a PowerPoint presentation. When Austin tried to interject with his value propositions, Khalid politely but firmly redirected the conversation back to me. "Perhaps we can discuss additional opportunities in our next quarterly review," he said diplomatically. After everyone signed and the photos were taken, Khalid pulled me aside. "Michael, what happened earlier?" The young man seemed unprepared for the technical requirements. "Growing pains," I said. "He's learning the industry." "I see. Well, perhaps in the future it would be better if you continued as our primary contact. We value experience in these matters. I think that can be arranged." The aftermath was swift and educational for everyone involved. Austin wasn't fired. Harold couldn't do that to his own son. But he was quietly moved to corporate strategy, where his analytical skills could be useful without endangering major client relationships. Amanda finished her consulting engagement and returned to McKinsey with what I'm sure was a very interesting case study about the importance of regulatory compliance in complex negotiations. Harold offered me a promotion to Senior VP of Strategic Accounts, with a compensation package that included a 15% salary increase, enhanced stock options, and a retention bonus that made my 401k look very healthy. More importantly, he gave me complete autonomy to manage my client relationships without interference. But the best part happened 6 weeks later. I was in my new corner office. Yes, Harold gave me the corner office with the view of downtown Houston, when Pete Morrison called. "Mike," he said, "I just heard through the legal community that Austin Caldwell has been asking around about international energy law. Word is he's taking night classes at South Texas College of Law. Is that right?" I said, though I was smiling. "You know what's funny? 20 years of practicing energy law, and I've never seen someone learn humility that efficiently. That key person clause was a masterpiece." That evening, I got home to find Linda cooking my favorite dinner, chicken fried steak with all the fixings. She'd heard about the promotion through the company Wives Network, which remains faster and more accurate than any corporate communication system ever invented. "So," she said as we sat down to eat, "are you finally ready to admit that all those years of dealing with office politics were worth something?" I thought about Austin, probably studying regulatory compliance law at his kitchen table. I thought about Amanda, explaining to her next client why relationship management can't be optimized with algorithms. I thought about Harold, who'd learned an expensive lesson about the difference between potential and experience. "You know what, Linda? I think I am." We talked about retirement plans and vacation destinations and all the things that 55-year-old couples discuss when they finally have real financial security. But in the back of my mind, I was thinking about something my old drill sergeant used to say: the best victories are the ones that teach lessons. Austin learned that experience isn't just another word for outdated. Harold learned that family loyalty has to be balanced with business reality. And I learned that sometimes, if you're patient enough and careful enough, you can be both the teacher and the beneficiary of a very important lesson. I still had 10 years until retirement, and Gulf States was already talking about expanding their North American operations. After all, they valued experience in these matters. And experience, as it turns out, is exactly what I had to offer.